So in pop culture, there's always been this prevailing notion that Phineas Gage, after his incident, after he got a metal rod go right through his skull and lost some of his brain matter along the way, that he turned into a completely different person. He went from being someone who was reserved and shy and like meticulous and a balanced human being into someone who was completely impulsive, someone who liked to curse a lot, someone who was just all over the place, unable to commit to things and whatnot. And this sounds like some of the exes of my friends, but you know, it's just like they just make it out to be like this happened to him and then it changed him for life. And the reality of the situation is that was not the case. Like Gage might have actually been able to recover to the point where he could do things that people nowadays write him off for. After his recovery, within a few years, he had gotten himself a stable job as a carriage driver in Chile. And so that type of work requires a lot of planning. You're supposed to be able to tend to the horses, be able to converse with passengers over these long distances. It does not make sense. So that means that Gage most likely was able to resemble a normal life afterwards, even though ultimately it was the damage from that incident that later led to seizures that ultimately killed him. What can you say? And so in 2012, researchers had found that by doing like a reconstruction of the accident, that Gage had lost approximately a tenth of the white matter that was in his frontal lobe, and he also lost 4% of his cerebral cortex. That's a lot of damage. But I think one thing that's slightly more interesting about this whole thing is that most of what we know about Phineas Gage comes from one doctor's account of Gage's accident and what transpired afterwards, after he was admitted for care. And that was Dr. Harlow. And Dr. Harlow was someone who believed around this time in phrenology. And phrenology is this idea that based on the skull, you can determine things about a person's personality and, you know, their intelligence and all this other stuff. And that is not true. There's no basis for it. So Harlow was more, as someone who was a proponent of phrenology, he was more inclined to believe that, yeah, Gage's brain damage resulted in personality changes. But in 1850, which was 2 years after the accident, Dr. Bigelow had asked to see Gage and basically determine the validity of his accident. It's kind of a crazy story. Like, okay guys, hear me out. Checks out to me. So he signed off on it as like, yeah, Gage really did have this accident occur to him, but they didn't really make any specific claims about personality at this time because Gage, you know, he's still alive. Imagine if someone who was like, imagine your doctor coming up to you and then using you as like a case study. Is like, yeah, you know, you were all right before the accident and then you just turn into a complete slouch. You're terrible. Everyone hates you. Like, that doesn't seem pretty sound. So much of what we know about Gage's supposed behavioral transformation comes to us after his death. And that is why we see Harlow's report on Gage cited so frequently, because that's like the final word, if you will, on, okay, this is the outcome of this man's life. Bigelow was not really concerned with phrenology. He kind of just wrote it off as not much of a big deal. And so I think while a little bit of the truth of Gage's situation is always going to be a little bit uncertain because we don't know much besides what the original source gave us, and keeping in mind that Dr. Harlow, as the source, can also be an unreliable narrator who might have recorded his observations as something that would align more closely with something that he was a proponent for. Despite all that, we still do have this remarkable case of someone who's able to recover from an extensively seeming brain injury and still be able to have that psychosocial adaptation in order to continue living their life. While Gage's demise is something that is unfortunate, it's still really cool because this is like one of the first recorded cases where we really paid attention to different structures being impacted by damage or, you know, an ablation or a freak accident. It could result in changes in a person's ability to do certain tasks or or even their personality. So Phineas Gage had an accident. A metal rod went through his frontal lobe, clean through, and even though initially his personality was reported to be rambunctious, just rowdy, unruly, and different from who he was before the accident, we do have some instances of reports where he may have been able to recover from those personality changes that had occurred after the accident and resume somewhat of a normal life. And so even though he did have an early demise, he was still able to live life as Phineas Gage. And so that's pretty cool. I don't know, what do you guys think? Have you read anything recently about Phineas Gage? If you have, just let me know. I'd love to read more about it. And if I said anything wrong in this video, feel free to correct me. I love learning from you. Thanks for watching.